Hello, and thanks for joining us today for Sky Islands in the California deserts. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to welcome any of you who are new to the California Native Plant Society and tell you a little bit about our organization and our favorite topic, California native plants. California's native plants are what make California look like California, from the Joshua tree of the Mojave Desert to the redwood forest of the North Coast. We are lucky to live in one of the most botanically rich places on Earth, with more types of native plants than any other state in the US. At the California Native Plant Society, we think that's something worth celebrating and protecting, and we invite you to join us. CNPS is a nonprofit organization made of more than 10,000 members, 35 local chapters, and a team of staff. Today, we're working together to conserve wildlands, protect endangered species, collect scientific data, and restore nature to our home and public landscapes, one garden at a time. We're the voice for plants. And plants need us now more than ever as we face the combined challenges of climate change, extinction crises, and growing development pressure. But we need them too. In fact, none of us, not the insects, not the birds, nor humans, can exist without them. So when we save plants, we save everything else. If you're inspired by what you see and hear today, please consider getting involved. Become a member by visiting cnps.org/join, or sign up to receive our emails and learn more about what we're doing at cnps.org/get-connected. Now I want to introduce the team that's producing our show today. So I'll start with Kate Barrows, who will wrangle the questions that you put in the Q&A. Can you describe that for us, Kate?
Yes, thanks, Orchid, and welcome everyone. So we'd like to ask you if you have questions to enter those in the Q&A. You'll see that at the bottom of your screen. It's easiest for us if you do that in the Q&A and not use the chat, although I'll be monitoring that as well. So at the end of the talk, we will go through the questions and you can get your questions answered, and you can enter questions at any time. Thanks.
And thank you, Katie. And now I'd like to introduce Ed Harrison, who is our Zoom wrangler and social media star.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here.
So questions that you have, if you're having technical issues, those questions should go to Ed. So now I would like to introduce our speaker, Colin. Can you bring up your video? Hey, Colin. So Colin is a Coachella Valley naturalist and desert advocate who works to promote conservation of natural open spaces and native species. He works with local agencies to advance habitat conservation, recreation trails planning, so everyone can get out despite what's going on, and education about desert ecosystem. He also serves on the board of the Mount San Jacinto Natural History Association. So Colin, tell us what you're gonna talk about today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you everybody for being here. And let me start sharing my screen here if I can find that. So our talk today is, or my talk today is about Sky Islands and climate refugia in the deserts of Southern California. And we're going to talk about what is a Sky Island, what is a climate refugia, and how sort of the past, present, and future of climate change. I want to start off by just sort of giving a little bit of background about this talk in general. I've given it a few times, and it started out as a talk that was supposed to be accompanied by a hike where we would, I gave the talk and we would go out on a hike, and the particular hike that we went to was to the Hidden Lake Preserve in Mount San Jacinto State Park. I did this as a hike for the Mount San Jacinto Natural History Association, where I'm a board member. And I really think that it's meant to the talk is meant to give you the background so that when you go out in the field and where you're going out on a hike or a walk or standing in your backyard looking up at the mountains, to give you kind of a different way of thinking about what you're seeing. And so even though we're not going to go for a hike altogether after the presentation today, I really encourage everyone to make a commitment to yourself to either later on this afternoon or tomorrow or sometime over the long weekend to this week to get outside and to think about the things that you're seeing maybe in a way that haven't done it before, and think about climate change and think about why the plants and animals that we see on the landscape are where they are and how they might change in the future. So with that, let's get started. So I start off this talk with this slide, and it's kind of meant to be a general audience slide. I'm guessing we kind of have a pretty savvy crew today that probably knows what a sky island is or has heard of sky islands before. But even if you haven't, that's okay, because this is kind of the starting point here, maybe what you might think of as a sky island. And if you recognize this image or don't recognize it, this is from the movie Avatar, and it's kind of like a literal sky island, these totally make-believe gravity-defying islands in the sky. That's not what we're talking about today. So we're talking about sky islands, which are not the kind of islands maybe that you would be familiar with, but like a geographic island, but an ecological island. So let's look at the geographic island first, or a geographic island and an ecological island. And you may recognize the satellite view, or the aerial view of these islands that we're looking at here. These are the Galapagos Islands on the equator. And they're quite famous, of course, for being one of the places where Charles Darwin visited, and one of the places where he started to, sorry about my cat, Banjo's hungry, started to formulate his ideas about the theory of evolution, which is kind of lays the basis for all of modern biology. And the Galapagos Islands are both geographic islands where you have the land in the middle of the water, and ecological islands where you have one type of habitat or one type of environment that rapidly changes into another type of environment, so that the plants and animals or the organisms on either side of those two environments are sort of have a barrier where they're not able to mix quite as freely as they might otherwise able to, because their adaptations are so different. And let's just look at some examples of the kind of power that these ecological islands have in shaping species development. So this is a marine iguana, which is an animal that's found only in the Galapagos Islands and nowhere else on Earth. And unlike basically every other reptile on Earth, it makes its living, it survives in the environment by swimming in the ocean and eating algae, instead of being up in the trees or being in the rocks and eating plants or eating other lizards or insects or anything like that. These marine iguanas swim through the ocean and eat algae. And if you know anything about lizard physiology, we're going to talk a lot about plants today, but lizards are also like right up there as being one of the really cool organisms to think about. So anyway, if you know anything about lizards physiology, you know they're cold-blooded, and it can be really difficult for them to regulate their body temperature. So they've come up with all these amazing adaptations in the Galapagos to be able to do this, to dive into the cold water, or relatively cold water, and survive. So there can be new species, and there can also be the same species that we're familiar with in these island environments, both ecological and geographic islands, that have different behavioral adaptations. So this is a blue-footed booby, and these are kind of found on shorelines throughout the world. You can actually see them in the Coachella Valley region, down by the Salton Sea occasionally. And they're the same species in the Galapagos Island as you'd see anywhere else, but they are behaviorally very different. and that they have no fear at all of people. Having been to the Galapagos Islands, if you've been to the Galapagos Islands, you can walk right up to a blue-footed booby and you can almost like shake its foot and say hello. They really have no fear of predators because there are no natural predators, or very few natural predators on the Galapagos Islands that have sort of made that journey out to the islands themselves. And just one more example here. This is another bird called a flightless cormorant that lives in the Galapagos Islands and nowhere else on Earth. And I like to use this example because I think as human beings, we think of the power of flight as being this really amazing superpower. You know, that Superman gets to fly. If you ask people what the #1 superpower they'd want to have, most people say they want to fly, they want to be able to fly, or more people say fly than anything else. And flightless cormorants, through living on a ecological island as well as a geographic island, have evolved and adapted to totally give up that superpower. They don't need it at all. So this is not like a diseased animal or that has something wrong with its wings. This is exactly what flightless cormorants look like. And you can think of evolutionarily, they're sort of maybe on their way to be something like a penguin, a totally flightless animal that's just adapted to diving and swimming underwater and hunting for fish. So now that we've covered sort of the geographic islands and seen some really, I think, remarkable examples of sort of the evolutionary power of those ecological islands, let's talk a little bit, bring it closer to home, back to Southern California here, and talk about how we can see those same kinds of island effects here in our mountains and in our desert. So this is the view from the very top of Mount San Jacinto, and I think it gives you kind of an idea for how you might start to think about this mountain, which you don't normally think of as an island, as being a sky island. So we're looking down towards Hemet and Temecula in this image, but the clouds have totally obscured that because you're actually standing above the clouds and looking down onto this ocean of clouds, just like island in the ocean, the mountain is an island in the sky. In addition to that top of the peak there, where we can see in this image, this is a view from Joshua Tree National Park looking across at Mount San Jacinto. So in addition to that sky island at the top of the peak, we can also find island effects all the way, starting at the bottom, all the way up and throughout. So you can imagine that down in the valley floor or in other parts of Southern California in valleys, we have an environment that's very different from the mountain slopes. So you have sand dune environments in a lot of places. The ecology is very different, and the plants and animals that have adapted to this environment it becomes very difficult for them to then move into new environments from these specialized adaptations. So one example of that here in the Coachella Valley is the Coachella Valley milkvetch, which is a subspecies of the freckled milkvetch, Astragalus lentiginosus. And you can see that this plant here is totally at home in this sand dune environment. This is taken from the Kim Nickel Trail out near Desert Hot Springs. And these are subspecies of plants that has adapted to the sand dune environments of the Coachella Valley and exist only here, nowhere else on Earth. And if you were to try to take this plant out of those environments and plant it up on the top of Mount San Jacinto or in your yard in Riverside or something like that, it probably wouldn't work very well, right? So it's got these specific adaptations. And when you get to the edge of the sand dune, it's this pretty rapid change between sand and alluvial fan or whatever the surrounding area is, that is not, the adaptations don't cross over anymore. So we're talking about an ecological island here. Here's a map showing, this is CalFlora distribution map of the Coachella Valley milkvetch, and you can see its entire range in the whole world. It's just found in these kind of sandy environments in the middle of the Coachella Valley and a little bit out into the pass where there's sand coming down from the Whitewater River channel. Moving up the mountain, we have another ecological island, the desert slopes. And you can get a feel for really when they're in the spring and really blooming very well. This is kind of what you'd hope they look like. And we have some unique plants found here as well, like the California fan palm. So California fan palms, of course, are planted all over the place and are kind of actually invasive outside of their native range. So you'll see dots kind of messy on the map here, but certainly their native range is pretty isolated here in kind of northern Ansborrego Desert and the Coachella Valley, a little bit up into Joshua Tree. And as you start to see these maps, you can kind of see how compact the ranges are and start to get a feeling for those species that may be feeling those island effects, as opposed to something like, if you look at a range map of creosote bush or something like that, it's everywhere. Or if you look at a map of ponderosa pine, they're all over the Western United States, whereas these species have these very small ranges, native ranges. Another example of that is the Santa Rosa sage. This is one of my favorite plants, which is a species that's, as you can probably guess by the name, endemic to the Santa Rosa Mountains. You can see the range here. Again, kind of northern Ansborrego, and then the Santa Rosa and San Jacinto Mountains National Monument is a whole range in the world. Moving up, you get into the chaparral and pinyon juniper woodland ecological island habitats. There's a view of pinyon juniper woodland from the Cactus Spring Trail. And another one of my favorite plants in the front here is the four-needle pinyon pine, or Pinus quadrifolia. And although these plants are found further south into Baja California, we are reaching another kind of type of ecological island here, because here in the Coachella Valley, we're on one side of the San Andreas Fault, or we like straddle the line and down the San Andreas Fault. So these sort of mid-level pine trees are found here in the Coachella Valley, further south of us, but they don't go any further north. So we're right at the limit here. And that's partly because of this pass in the middle here. So the pass drops down to nearly sea level, and then you have 10,000, 11,000, almost 12,000 foot mountains on either side of it. Makes it very difficult for plants that are adapted to that high and middle environment to cross over this low, very narrow pass in between. Another one, this is the white margined Oxytheca, which is found kind of in the chaparral environments along the San Jacintos and Santa Rosas. And here's its whole range in the whole world. You can stand up on the Pacific Crest Trail around kind of Pine Mountain area in Garden Valley, overlooking Garden Valley, and you can see the whole range of this plant in the entire world. It's a pretty tiny, beautiful little plant to see when it's along the side of the trail, but can't find it anywhere else. Moving up into the Montane Forests, again, very different environment of ecological island compared to that pinyon juniper woodland below. And here you find plants like the lemon lily. Looking at the range there, you can really start to see those islands, the high mountain islands, sky islands, between the San Bernardinos, the San Jacintos, and Mount San Antonio. And we also have plants like the San Jacinto Lupine. And here you can see the range of that one. Again, only found basically in the San Jacintos and a little bit down Mount San Antonio. And actually there's a population down in Baja California. There's some really interesting connections there, but all sky islands. And then up at the very tippy top into the alpine zone or subalpine zone in some places. Again, this is back to the top of Mount San Jacinto. And there you get plants like the Pinus flexilis, limber pine. And again, those ranges, if you're looking at the range map, they're just contracting further and further down into these little pockets of places where they're able to survive. So we're just going to look real quickly sort of at the diversity here, the kind of diversity that these kinds of ecological islands have allowed to flourish. So just taking the Santa Rosa and San Jacinto Mountains National Monument as an example, we're going to look at iNaturalist observations. For those of you who know me, you know I'm like an iNaturalist crazy person, we'll say almost, maybe not almost. So we look at that environment, and over, let's say, 300,000 acres, there have been about 20,000 observations, and my bar's in the way, over 1,000 species observed here. And let's just say, as an example, as a comparison, let's compare that to the Galapagos Islands. So we've got a much larger area, huge area, a similar number of observations, but fewer species. So I like to look at this comparison here and think about what kind of discoveries or what kind of thought processes Charles Darwin might have started in his mind if he had come to the Santa Rosa and San Jacinto Mountains and Southern California deserts instead of going to the Galapagos. All right, so we've talked about sky islands and the concept of an ecological island, and I think seen why those sky islands are important in terms of the unique plants and animals, or unique plants at least so far, that you can find in sky islands. And now we're gonna go to the other part of our talk today, which is the climate and climate refugia. So setting aside the issue of anthropogenic climate change for at least a few minutes, let's talk about sort of the last few 100,000 years of climate change. And right, what we're looking at here is actually a photograph, again, aerial photograph of the Greenland ice sheet. And if you look back over the last 400,000 years of the Earth's climate, we've had a lot of climate change, natural climate change, and cycles between warm periods and ice ages. So what we're looking at here are peaks of the warm periods, and the valleys or the low areas are the ice ages. In fact, we spend more time in ice ages than we have in warm periods, at least over the sort of temperature record that we can reconstruct. This is the most recent sort of a reconstruction of the most recent ice age. The Laurentide ice sheet came down over much of North America, especially the eastern part of North America. And in the West, the topography helped to make those, to sort of impede the flow of the ice sheet a little bit. You know, we have all these high mountains, and the ice sheets were not able to expand as much, and the differences in topography helped to create a wider range of climatic conditions where plants and animals were able to survive. And those are the climate refugia that we're talking about. We'll look at a little bit of an example there. So you can imagine this, again, ice sheet in Greenland, where if you're looking out across that expanse, there's really not much living there. There's a few polar bears and seals and things at the edges, but there's no plant life at all, basically, and not much diversity. So let's think about sort of a mental model. Let's build like a simple mental model of climate change. So just kind of stare at this image, and we're going to imagine that this is the side of a mountain, and we're going to think about how plants and animals react to changes in temperature. So we've got looking at the side of a mountain, the bottoms of the mountains are warmer or orange, and the tops of the mountains are cooler or blue. And that's because of changes in pressure as you increase in temperature or increase in altitude. So it's true basically everywhere else. It's like, you know, it's basic physics. And we're going to think about now this new species that we've all just discovered together, the smiley-faced dogweed, which I'm naming Adenophilum emojii. And his preferred range is in this yellow band here in the middle here. And the yellow band kind of fades out a little bit. So he's got a preferred band in the middle, and he can exist a little bit on the top of that and a little bit on the below of that. But really, this is kind of his cool area like there where he likes to be. And you can think about in a climate change, a natural climate change scenario where the temperature starts to warm coming out of an ice age, and that band that the smiley-faced dogweed prefers starts to move up the mountains like this. And that's okay. He can, especially over the kinds of time scales that we're talking about for the ice ages, takes thousands, tens of thousands of years for these changes to happen. Many plants have been able to make those changes to move up slopes or move down slopes as the temperature warmed and cooled. The individual plants may not survive, but the population is able to survive as it moves up and down. So again, we'll go back down to our sort of baseline example here and get a little bit more complicated. So we've got this simple mental model of how plants and animals might respond to changing temperature. Now let's make it a little bit more realistic and add some topography. And you can see it makes it a lot more complex and matches what we start to see in the real world. So we all know if you go for a hike, there's not just like you get to a certain elevation and you start seeing a certain plant and then you get to a certain elevation and they disappear. No, you go through a canyon and you find some high elevation species that have managed to survive down low, or you go out on an exposed ridge and you find some lower elevation species that are much higher than you would normally expect them. And so this yellow band where the smiley-faced dogweed likes to live is not just a horizontal bar. It's this can be very variable in terms of the elevation. So there's still kind of a band that it prefers there, but it can still, there's a lot of variation within that band. And again, under a warming scenario, they can still move up to the tops of the mountains and be okay. And again, now stepping back out of that really hypothetical, simple scenario, we can look at the topography of North America and start to see where those kinds of climate refugia, those geographic, the complexity of the geography can allow for these climate refugia to persist. So this is a computer simulation of what the last ice age might have looked like near its peak. And if you're looking down in our area of North America, you can see that there was ice down there for sure, but the topography was varied enough that there were still pockets where species were able to survive. And so that's why during those ice ages, even though the climate shifted many times, we still are able to find a relatively, if you look back at pollen data and things like that, you can still see species have been able to survive in the same area for long periods of time, for hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years. And again, just kind of looking at a satellite view here of Southern California, the area we all are thinking about and hopefully going to be going for a hike soon to think about. You can really visualize the complexity of the geography here and see where there might be all kinds of interesting climate refugia in the mountains here and along the mountains here and in these canyons along the San Jacintos. So, and in fact, if we do go out there, we can see examples of that. So again, originally we would be going out in just a few minutes to go look at the Hidden Lake Blue Curls, or go to see the Hidden Lake Preserve. And there's the Hidden Lake Blue Curls is a unique endemic plant that's only found right at Hidden Lake. So what we're looking at here is not Hidden Lake Blue Curls. This is Parrish's Blue Curls, which is a Southern California native plant. You can see they have these really cool flowers. Blue curls in general have these really cool flowers that curl over and have these really great markings that are probably lighting up for some kind of special message to the bees that like to pollinate them. And here's a range of Parrish's blue curls. So we've got a little bit of a sort of a mid-elevation or mid-altitude island effect there, looking at the map, but they're pretty much widespread throughout Southern California. And in the same genus, we have this hidden lake blue curl. So this plant is, if you're looking at this on a phone, it might be pretty close to actual size. They're tiny, tiny little plants, about this big. And you can see the flowers, you can see how they have that curl, how they're related. But if you look at the range of these plants, they're incredibly limited, probably as limited as just about anything on Earth. It's hard to get much more limited than the hidden lake blue curls. It's like the Death Valley pupfish and these guys. And this is their habitat when it's looking really good. So this is Hidden Lake in the San Jacinto Mountains. And if you've spent much time hiking in the San Jacintos or in Joshua Tree, or Santa Rosa, or anywhere else, you can imagine why the hidden lake blue curls are found here and nowhere else, because there's really nothing that looks like this anywhere else in the San Jacinto Mountains, at least naturally. So the hidden lake blue curls have at one point shared a common ancestor with the Parrish's blue curls and all the other blue curls, and adapted to this kind of mountain environment. And as probably were more widespread during the last ice age, when this kind of environment maybe was more common. But as the climate has warmed naturally into our current warm period, their range contracted into just the shores of this lake. And it's really more of a vernal pool. So this is like as full as it gets and as green as it gets. If you go there in the summer, it's just a field of, or I go there in the winter, it's just a field of snow. If you go there in the late fall, you might just see a meadow. So we've now covered the Sky Islands, we've covered the climate refugia. Hopefully we're starting to see how those two concepts are important together in explaining the plants and animals that we see when we are outside here in Southern California and in the desert of Southern California. And now, unfortunately, we have to talk a little bit about the future and what that might look like going forward. So this is the same temperature map that we looked at a few minutes ago, showing the last few 400,000 years, 450,000 years or so of temperature. And again, we've had this natural variation between cold periods and warm periods. We're in the warm period now. Now this chart looks really similar. I'll go back and forth a couple of times so you can see. You can see the peaks and the valleys match each other almost perfectly on these two graphs. But this graph is showing us something different. It's not showing temperature at all. It's showing us the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as measured through ice cores and any other kind of paleoclimate methods that we've been able to figure out. So we have this reconstruction of carbon dioxide over the last 450,000 years or so. And you can see that carbon dioxide and temperature have matched each other almost perfectly over that time period. Except for, and so the graphs are really similar, except for right over here at the far end where we are today. And so instead of being down here, kind of at the peaks, the previous peaks, we're like off the scale of the chart in terms of carbon dioxide. And this is kind of a chart that makes you, at least makes me want to buy a Prius and stop eating meat and vote for Democrats and all that kind of stuff. And then hopefully it should do all those things to you too, because this is kind of scary. If we're thinking about where temperature is now, and if we think of carbon dioxide as a leading indicator to temperature, and you start to imagine where temperature could be if we allow this kind of, well, if we allow, we've already allowed it to happen, where temperature could be if this kind of concentration of carbon dioxide persists in the atmosphere and we don't change that kind of environment, we're in for some really serious or really dramatic changes in terms of the climate of the Earth. And not necessarily making a judgment on whether those are good or bad changes yet, because we're not there yet. We can't necessarily see what they are. But the fact that this is so far outside of kind of the charted territory of what we're familiar with, and so far outside of what not only the plants and animals that we know and love, but our human society has been adapted to over the last 10,000, 20,000 years, should be concerning. So taking a break from the reconstruction of temperature and reconstruction of CO2, we can also see that just from by direct measurements, mean global temperatures are definitely increasing. There's no doubt about that. And temperatures in the Coachella Valley are increasing. So these are temperature readings directly from the Coachella Valley, both the blue line, which are minimum temperatures, and the orange line, which are just regular mean temperatures. So our minimum temperatures are actually going up faster than our average temperature overall. And you can see that's actually, so we've gone up plus 2 degrees Celsius on average, which is actually above what, if you look at like the IPCC climate report, they say, well, we really want to limit global climate change to 1.5 degrees Celsius to avoid the worst effects. Well, the Coachella Valley has already gone past that. So it could be, and we're starting to see maybe that the deserts of the world may be facing the effects of climate change or feeling the effects of climate change sooner and more acutely than other parts of the world. I mean, the poles, if you look at the temperature changes, the North and the South Pole are way past plus 2 degrees Celsius already. The temperate latitudes, in some cases, are either only gone up a little bit or even have gone down in the average. In the Coachella Valley, we're above where we want our global temperature to be already. And also rainfall, we think is changing. The story on rainfall is a little bit less clear, and this graph doesn't include the last couple of years of really heavy rainfall, or the 2 years before this one of really heavy rainfall. So we're not quite as sure about how rainfall is going to change going forward. It could conceivably lead to a wetter Southern California or a more variable Southern California with wetter flood conditions and drier drought conditions in between, which may be what we're seeing this year, unfortunately. So again, going back to our smiley face dogweed and thinking about how he's doing okay there at the top of the mountain. If we start to push the smiley face dogweed into uncharted territory, he's still alive. You can still see that yellow band is still there in those bands of the place where he likes to survive. But they're no longer connected, so which can be a problem for species and survival. And let's look at an example of how that might play out in the real world. So we're going to look at Joshua trees for a few minutes here. Joshua trees, of course, are those iconic members of the Mojave Desert found on the north of the Coachella Valley here, and then up into Mojave Desert, Mojave National Preserve, and Nevada. And research over the last few years has been trying to answer the question, well, how are Joshua trees going to respond to that? This is research that's been done by University of California, Riverside. So we're looking at an elevation map of the Coachella Valley and of Joshua Tree National Park here. And if you look at the existing range of Joshua trees, those are represented by a red dot. So these are actual observations of Joshua trees and the landscape. We can then take these observations and feed it into this elevation model and also take into account rainfall and temperature and soil moisture and all kinds of different things, and start to build a model of where we think Joshua trees should be able to survive. And that's what this looks like. So we've got the orange kind of color here, yellow-orange color, as the modeled habitat of Joshua trees. And it looks pretty good. There's this big chunk of territory up here that doesn't seem to have any Joshua trees in it that otherwise should be good for Joshua trees according to the model. But at least in Joshua Tree National Park, the model looks pretty good. So now that we have the model and we're more or less happy with it, we can make changes to the underlying conditions to see what happens. And specifically, we can make changes to the temperature. And if we increase the temperature, see what we think Joshua trees would do under that scenario. And so if you increase the temperature 1 degree Celsius, this is what the model thinks would happen to the range of Joshua trees. So certainly the range would contract and get smaller, but under 1 degrees Celsius change, they're still there. And that's kind of what we're under current conditions, basically. Now, if you really increase the temperature 3 degrees Celsius, then you're looking at the black dots here. And here you can kind of start to see where that simplified model is starting to come into play. So the Joshua trees are still there, excuse me, but their range is no longer connected. It's broken up into these smaller subpopulations. So the good news is they're still there. The bad news is they're in these smaller subpopulations, and the smaller subpopulations are vulnerable, more vulnerable to things like wildfire. So this is I think this is the lake fire from a few years ago, burning above Palm Springs in the San Gorgonio Mountains and burning some Joshua trees down towards the Pioneer Town Mountains Preserve and into Burns Canyon. I think that, not Burns Canyon. I'm messing up the name there, but burning in that area. And this is the area up near Hidden Lake that's right at the edge of the mountain fire burn area. In fact, I'm standing on the ridgeline here looking down into the mountain fire burn area. And if I turned around, Hidden Lake would be in the same view. I'm right there at the edges of Hidden Lake. So the wildfires, which are in most cases a natural part of the landscape, not as much in the desert, but at least in the chaparral and in the forests, fires have always been here. They're a natural part of the environment, and many species are fire adapted to them. Fires can start to be more of a problem when you have those segmented habitats where one fire, especially the larger fires that we're starting to see now, are able to consume an entire subpopulation. And after 2 or 3 fires in 2 or 3 subpopulations, you start to run out of subpopulations, and that's where the problem is. The other problem that we're running out is, again, this is one we're not as sure about, but thinking about the variability in rainfall in a year like this one, where it's very dry, you can take a view of this like Hidden Lake and come back the very next year and basically the same day of the year, the same month, and see Hidden Lake looking like this. So in the time I've been going up to Hidden Lake every year for the last 3 or 4 years, and it's been kind of average full 1 year and really full 2 years, and then this was the other year. And this is what it looked like this year too. Of course, the tram is closed, so I haven't been up there to look at it, but from people who have been up there, they told me that this is what it looked like this year. And it's part of the natural variation in the Hidden Lake. It's not like the Hidden Lake blue corals won't be able to come back from this. They're still will be there in the next wet year. But if you start to string together enough dry years, or if you string together some dry years and you start to interrupt those dry years with a wildfire or two, that starts to be really concerning. We could be into a scenario where the Hidden Lake blue corals goes extinct, or the Joshua tree goes locally extinct, or the Santa Rosa sage goes extinct, or any of the dozens or hundreds or thousands of species of plants that we all love here in Southern California start to go extinct. And not just bad for the plants, it's bad for us too. The plants are not just giving us enjoyment from us getting to look at them, but also providing those ecosystem processes for clean air and clean water and erosion control and all these kinds of things that human beings rely on for us to thrive in our society. So under a warming scenario, this is like the nightmare scenario where our smiley face dogweed is no longer smiley face. Where like blue curls are no longer around, and where people maybe are no longer able to survive as well as we in the way that we have been accustomed to. So on that happy note, what can we do to make a difference, to not just say, well, this is going to happen, but what can we do as members of our community, as members of the world, and of the local community to counteract these effects of climate change. I mean, we're basically committed. I mean, climate change is already happening, and we'll see that, or we have seen that. But how can we counteract the worst effects, or how can we adapt to the worst effects, or be resilient in the face of some of the worst effects? Well, one way, and one of the ways I really enjoy personally doing that is through community science. So this is a team of community scientists who actually, this is just taken yesterday, so this is hot off the presses, out on newly protected property in Palm Springs called Oswit Canyon, which was protected by the Oswit Land Trust, just acquired a few months ago. And we, working with researchers at the University of California, Riverside, and this team of community scientists, we were out there documenting the plants and animals that we found there. So we're looking at a few different species found throughout the deserts. So this is a tag on a creosote bush. We're also looking at brittle bush and jojoba and plants further up in the other ecological islands like pinyon pines, and up on top like the limber pines. And we're cataloging these individual plants, and we're also taking a survey of the changes going along that plants by doing these surveys once per year, as long as we can find volunteers and people interested to do it. So it's been going on for about 3 or 4 years now, and I think this is the third full year, maybe the fourth full year of surveys. So we go back to these same plants year after year, so we tag them so we can find them again, look at the condition of the plant, and count the number and health of the plants around them. So whether there's a bunch of dead plants or living plants or seedlings, or whether there's recruitment and those kinds of things. So through these measurements, we can, over time, start to see how climate change is affecting different species. So some species we expect will probably not really care about climate change at all, and some species are really going to care. So we want to know what those ones that really going to care are. There's a group doing these survey transects around the creosote bush here on the right-hand side of the screen. And we are starting to see some results from that. So this is just an example, but one of our survey sites is on the Buhoff Trail, and this is an image taken from there looking at brittle bush. So at an elevation of 656 feet, you can see in the yellow circles all of the living brittle bush in the picture, and in the red circles all of the dead brittle bush. So it turns out if you count that and tally it up, at 656 feet, over half of the brittle bush are already dead, and due to some combination of drought or climate change or the connected factors between the two. Moving up the slope, so same trail, same geology, same everything else, but we're just moving up the slope on that sort of climate simple model that we've built for ourselves at 1,800 feet. Again, yellow circles are alive, red circles are dead. And now only about a quarter of the brittle bush are dead. So still feeling the effects, but the plants, the brittle are doing much better at that elevation. And then just about at the top of the trail at about 2,200 feet, again, the living ones and the one dead one, only 2% dead. So this is giving us some hope that all is not lost, that these kinds of, that the brittle bush may be dying off at lower elevations, but they're finding refugia, climate refugia, at upper elevations. So they're still able to survive even under a warming environment. So that's one way of participating in those community science projects. And the other way, to give a shout out to the California Native Plant Society, is right in your backyard. So we're looking at a picture of my front yard, my wife and my front yard. This was right after we moved in. And the only native plant in the yard when we moved in was this California fan palm, and unfortunately had been trimmed pretty heavily. So it doesn't have that nice intact skirt like we'd like to see, but we do have the one native plant, but otherwise it's just kind of a gravel scape with some red yuccas and ficus planted and things like that. And so like as soon as it cooled down, we moved in September. It was pretty hot to try and do too much work at that point. But basically, as soon as it cooled down enough to start doing work, we started digging everything up and converting the yard into native plants. And this is just kind of a few. Here's some of the native plants that we got. We got some plants from Mojave Desert Land Trust and their native plant sale. And we got a lot of plants from the California Native Plant Society from this chapter's California plant sale. And here's what it looks like now. So we've got brittle bush and pencil cholla, barrel cactus, ocotillo, that fan palm, desert agaves, all native plants, milkweeds all growing here in this native environment. And as the plants grow and develop, they'll fill out the environment, and we have wildflower seeds planted and all that kind of good kind of stuff. And so you can actually take the concept of those islands, sky islands, and take the concept of the climate refugia, and you can take them into your backyard, into a place where you have some control over the climate. You can create a microclimate in your yard where plants are able to survive. So this is below anything that you'd find on the Boas Trail. We're basically living at sea level here. And the brittle bush will be able to survive in our yard because we're giving them a little bit of extra water, right? And the ocotillo will be able to survive in our yard. And the hummingbirds that like to survive from the ocotillo, and the bees and the butterflies and the beetles and the things that like the flowers of the brittle bush will still be able to find those things in our yard. And they can find them in your yard too if you plant these kinds of native plants in your yard. So you can be a part of that change by be a part of the solution, not only through these kinds of macro scale solutions like that need to happen at the government level or at the international level or state level or whatever, but you don't have to wait for all those people to get their act together. You can start taking action on your own today. And that's going to do it for my planned part of the talk today. I'm happy to take questions. I'd like to again recognize the Mount San Jacinto Natural History Association, where I originally developed this presentation and where I'm a board member. They provide educational programs on top of the Palm Springs Aerial Tramway. We're pretty much in kind of hiatus right now because the tram is closed, but we're planning some wonderful programs for whenever we're able to get back out there. And we also provide grant funding to schools to bring educational groups up on the tram so that they're able to get up on the tram on field trips and things like that at little to no cost. Additionally, if you'd like to contact me, I've got my email here, and you can visit my website or my website that I run with some collaborators called Cactus to Cloud, cactustocloud.org. And there's a contact form there. You can sign up for a mailing list and get updates on trail guides. And we're working on a Coachella Valley Parks resiliency rating program that looks at not just the climate change happening out in the sort of natural environment, quote unquote natural environment, but the climate change that's happening in our urban environment and the ways that we can improve the urban environment and make choices to improve the urban environment to make better, resilient communities for climate change and for environmental justice and for all of those associated issues in between. So if anybody has any questions, I'm available. And otherwise, thank you for listening.
Great. Thanks, Colin, for sharing some of the interesting ways that we can, as we explore some of these areas like the San Jacintos and other sky islands, think about not only the past effects, but the future effects. Really helpful. So thank you. So we do have questions. And if anybody has a question that you'd like to add, you can put that into the Q&A and we'll get those answered for you. We have a few questions here. First, actually not a question. Arlie Montalvo, who's on the board of the Riverside San Bernardino chapter, is saying, Colin, would you like to contact me about organizing a field trip after the pandemic is under control?
Yes.
I think we'd certainly like to have an opportunity for our chapter folks to enjoy a field trip, so we can follow up on that. Dee Himes has a quick question. What is the scientific name for the Santa Rosa sage?
Santa Rosa sage is Salvia, hard to pronounce. It's Salvia eramostachia.
Thank you. And then Susan Shiganaga has a question. Are all these plants that you have been identifying with very limited ranges protected? If so, what designation is this and how are they protected?
Great question. So a few of the plants that I mentioned, specifically at least the Coachella Valley milkfitch, is protected under the Coachella Valley Multiple Species Habitat Conservation Plan, which is the HCP that covers Eastern Riverside County. And many of the species that I talked about are CNPS listed plants. So they're species that, you know, the land managers responsible for the areas are looking out for when they're making land management decisions, and hopefully, and you know, if they're trying to have to approve a project or a trail project or something like that, they have to think about the impacts on those species before they do anything. Fortunately, we're really, in fact, very fortunate in the Coachella Valley and in most of the mountains of Southern California to be living among landscapes that are largely, at least in terms of the land itself, protected in either national monuments, national parks, or national forests, or state parks. So for the most part, all of the land itself is protected. That doesn't necessarily protect those species from climate change or from wildfires or from invasive species encroachment or anything like that. So the land that they're on is safe, but not necessarily the plants themselves.
Okay, thanks. Actually, Arlie just mentioned she had to leave, but she wanted to follow up with you separately on questions. Some comments about good program, terrific program. I have a question from Ken Gilliland. Are similar issues anticipated for animal life with Sky Island distributions?
Absolutely, and you know, it's going to depend on the animal. In fact, the other version of this presentation that I gave, the original version, talked a lot about lizards as well. You know, I changed it a little bit for the Native Plant Society to focus almost exclusively on plants, but so it's going to depend on the animals, and it's going to depend on the plants too. I mean, obviously, if you think about, take Joshua trees as an example, I think is a really good one, because Joshua trees are found all over the desert, Mojave Desert, across several state lines. And our understanding of the ecology of the Joshua trees is at least partly that they were able to spread across the landscape through a pretty unique seed dispersal mechanism, which were the giant ground sloths, where these giant sloths the size of VW buses that used to roam over the landscape during the last ice age. And they really liked to eat Joshua tree fruits, and they would roam over the landscape and poop out some Joshua tree fruits somewhere, some distance away, and the Joshua trees would be able to spread in that way. Of course, we don't have any giant ground sloths anymore. So the dispersal mechanism that the Joshua tree maybe is adapted to or evolved to has disappeared. And that has effect, so the way the Joshua tree, even under like a natural climate change scenario, then may not be able to spread in the way that it was, or may not be able to move up and down slopes in the way that it used to be able to. And that reverses back to the animals too. So the plants and the animals may have different responses to climate change, or in the case of the ground sloth, they have different responses to probably people coming on the scene and starting to hunt them. And as those different responses, you can have a pollinator or a seed dispersal mechanism that reacts very differently, that's totally wiped out by a plant, that's totally wiped out by climate change, where the plant is fine, or the other way around. The plant would be fine, except that its seed dispersal mechanism is no longer there anymore. And so you can get these really complex relationships. And they compounded by the fact that different animals can move in different ways. A lizard is kind of stuck on the top of a mountain. If it gets into that rising scenario, it's got nowhere to go. It's not going to be able to move miles and miles to get to the next mountaintop. But a woodpecker or something like that probably will be able to make that flight. So yes, we expect effects. We aren't sure what necessarily a lot of them are yet.
Okay, and I'm going to actually jump down to a follow-up question from Ken Gilliland. Is anyone investigating this possibility of the animals in Sky Islands?
Yes, you can look up the I'm blanking on the name now. There was a series of transects, the Grinnell transects, that were done throughout mountains in Southern California in the early 1900s by UC California sort of expedition led by Joseph Grinnell, and they documented many of the animals, especially the birds, that they saw at sites throughout Southern California, including in the San Jacinto Mountains. And for the 100th anniversary of those surveys, I believe it was the San Diego Natural History Museum recreated the expeditions and went back and did the same surveys in the same sites. And they definitely found that there were the abundance of different species of birds had changed over the last 100 years. So some species had gotten more abundant in the locations where they were surveyed, and some species had disappeared entirely. So if you want more information on that, look up the Grinnell survey.
Great, thanks. And I'll just mention, we can post some follow-up links to some of the information, including we'll look for and post that contact for San Diego Natural History Museum. It's a very fascinating study. Okay, next actually comment from Elizabeth Ogren Erickson, and perhaps a question that may be a little bit of a tease. She says, tremendous presentation. I'm wondering what the range is for Adenophilum emojii.
It's inside my hard drive. I don't know.
Bronwyn Jones has a
plant on Earth.
Bronwyn Jones has a comment. Idlewild was not included on the maps that you provided. I'm a native plant enthusiast and would love our Sky Island to be included in your future talks. Oh, well, I mean, Idlewild is definitely included. And certainly, like we talked about the lemon lilies, which you'll find above the mountain, in the, the streams above Idlewild. And Idlewild is just kind of the reverse side. And when I look at, from my backyard, I'm looking up at the Santa Rosa and San Jacinto Mountains. And from Idlewild, you're looking up at the same view, just reversed. You're looking up at the
the west-facing slope, I'm looking up at the east-facing slope, but the same concepts absolutely apply to both. And if you're in Riverside and you're looking up at the San Antonio Mountains or up at San Antonio, the same context apply. Or even if you're in Arizona, or if you're in another part of the world where you find these rapid changes between different ecological ecosystems, you'll find those island effects and you'll find unique plants and animals almost without fail.
Great. So there's a question from Carolyn West. Anything more on Joshua trees?
Yeah, and maybe that's another speaker you'd like to pursue. So the slides that I shared were actually fairly out of date research. That was like the first version of the study that was done by UC Riverside. The study's been updated and actually got quite a bit of press coverage. It was covered in Vogue and the New York Times and all kinds of good places. So Dr. Lynn Sweet would be able to answer those questions about the continuing research that's happening there much better than I could.
And Carolyn, we will locate Dr. Sweet's research and post a link to that on our website as well. We'll work on getting that out. So she's also a member of the Mojave Desert chapter of CNPS. Okay, next one from Peter Degano. Has anyone found a population of rubber boas in the San Jacinto area to match the one in the San Bernardino Mountains in similar habitat areas?
That's a good question. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear if they did.
Great. Well, if anybody wants to comment on that, we can post some follow-up information. We'll see if we can check in with folks on that information.
So I'll just add a little bit there, sorry.
Go ahead.
Briefly, that the first place I would go to look is on iNaturalist. And so I'll just give another plug to folks to check out. If you're not an iNaturalist user, or don't have an iNaturalist account, it's free. You know, it's super easy to put on your phone, and you can not only use the app to go out into anywhere in the world, really, but it's really active here in Southern California, luckily, and use the app to get help identifying the things you're seeing: plants, animals, fungi, insects, lichen, you know, you name it. But also to contribute to this database of knowledge about the distribution of plants and animals all over the world. So like a lot of the data that I shared today came from community scientists who are using iNaturalist to make observations of whether it's Joshua trees or sand boas or rubber boas or in like blue curls or whatever it is.
Okay, thanks. So we have a comment from an anonymous attendee. Excellent program. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you.
And the next question comes from Ken Gilliland again. What lizards were covered in the previous talk, or what lizards was the previous talk focused on?
So the lizards that we covered, so the Santa Rosa, San Jacinto Mountains and Joshua Tree, this Coachella Valley kind of as the center of that group of mountains, are home to some of the highest diversity of lizards in North America. You can find about more than 30 different species within, you know, probably half-hour drive of where I'm sitting now. And I focused, so we could talk about all kinds of lizards if we wanted to. I focused specifically on one genera of lizards, the Scaloporus or the spiny lizards, fence lizards, because we have 4 or 5, depending on how you count, different species found in our area here. And they tend to be more or less sorted along elevational gradient. So you'll find, for example, desert spiny lizards down at the bottom. You'll find them, you know, on the shores of the Salton Sea below sea level. And then you'll find things like the western fence lizard and kind of the mid elevations. You'll find them in Joshua Tree and in the chaparral environment. And then up at the top, or close to the top, you'll find sagebrush lizards up at the tram. So if you go up at the tram, the lizards you're seeing are almost all sagebrush lizards. And so you have that because they're sort of broken, at least on the desert side of the mountains along this elevational gradient, they provide a really good example of the ecological island effects.
Great, thank you. Let me just flip back to the next question. The next question is from Jared Anderson Huxley. Colin, it's my understanding that fire is a new phenomenon in the desert, which is largely driven by the invasion of flammable invasive species, particularly bromes. Is there an effective and scalable way to eradicate these species from the desert?
Not that we know of, that I'm aware of, at least. No, so I will say, you know, there are some types of high desert environments and some even low desert species which turn out to be a lot more resilient to fire than you might think. But for the most part, it's absolutely true that if you just think about kind of a natural desert environment with no invasive species, there's no ground cover to speak of. Let's say a lightning strike hits a creosote bush or a Joshua tree, it might cause that Joshua tree to burn up, and you know, maybe a few other Joshua trees nearby if debris kind of explodes away or is blown away maybe in high wind, something like that. But eventually it's going to run into enough dirt and rocks in between that it's going to limit the size of those fires. So the thinking is that these species just were never able to adapt to the kinds of wildfires that we see throughout the rest of Southern California. You know, chaparral is highly adapted to wildfire. Oaks and things like that come right back after a wildfire from the roots. But in the desert, that doesn't seem to be the case for the most part, outside of palm trees and a few high desert grass woodland kind of environments. So unfortunately, no, not that I'm aware of. I mean, there's herbicide treatments that you can use, not really workable on the scale of what we're talking about. You know, if you're talking about the whole desert, basically already totally covered in many cases with brome and schismus and some of the new stuff that we're starting to see, like Cape rice grass. And there are also native bromes and native rice grasses or native stipas that make finding like a biological control kind of unlikely to be effective, because if it's going to eat the non-native one, the invasive bromes, it'll probably eat the native one too.
Okay, thanks. And I can just comment, there is some work being done by groups, including CNPS and Friends of the Desert Mountains and others, to eradicate perennial bunch grasses like fountain grass, but the annuals like the bromes is very challenging. Okay, next item is just a comment from Jan Thompson. Well done, terrific information. And then James Gannon commented that rubber boas do occur in the San Jacintos, but the population is smaller and more limited. So thanks for that, James. Let's see, we have one more comment right now. If anybody else has a question. Oh no, I'm sorry, there are some others popping up, but Sue Shiganaga asks, how can we get on a list to be notified about these types of talks in the future? So thanks for that interest, Sue. We do have an email list that you can use for the Riverside San Bernardino chapter of the California Native Plant Society. And that is rsbcnps@gmail.com. rsbcnps@gmail.com, or you can also just type in California, Riverside San Bernardino, California Native Plant Society, and you'll get to our webpage. But we do have a list, and actually I might just, when we finish this list of questions, I'll ask Orchid to give folks an introduction to our February program that's coming up. So please do feel free. We certainly encourage you to consider becoming a member of CNPS, but you don't have to be a member to get the notices. And we're really enjoying the opportunity in these times of the pandemic to be able to reach out and provide programs and actually get a much higher level of participation when we don't all have to drive to a meeting location. And of course, that's more climate friendly as well. Okay, Spider Fox says that the southern rubber boa, Chirina umbratica, has threatened status under the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. I don't see any other questions. If you want to, oh, I'm sorry, oh, Spider, that's also in the chat room. Thank you. Excuse me, I am just scanning through the chat real quick. Ken noted that Brian Hines would be a great resource regarding rubber boas, and he's apparently available on iNaturalist, or you could find his records. More comments. Thanks for the presentation. Orchid has a question. What is the region for the rainfall slide? And did the Fish and Wildlife Service choose not to set aside habitat for hidden lake blue curls?
So the rainfall slide, I believe, that's Coachella Valley. So that maybe there's a weather station in Thermal at the airport there that I think is where that data is from. I'm not 100% sure about that, but it's Coachella Valley local, either Palm Springs or Thermal. So the hidden lake blue curls is found in the Hidden Divide Natural Preserve, which is protected inside of the Mount San Jacinto State Park. It did have a special status for many years, and you weren't even allowed to go to Hidden Lake to see it. It was so protected. In the last few years, they've started to loosen those protections a little bit because outside of climate change and wildfire, there's not really any development pressure or doesn't seem to be invasive species pressure or anything like that on the Hidden Lake blue curls. So you can now, when the tram is open, you can take the tram up and go to the ranger station in Long Valley and get a day permit to go and visit Hidden Lake. And it's limited to a certain number of people per day. I think it's like 30 people per day or something like that. And there's kind of a little boardwalk trail that you can kind of go around the lake and along the barrier where there's no hidden lake blue curls, and they give you a little training or a little talk about not going down to the shores of the lake or anything like that to protect the blue curls. But it's still a nice place to visit, and with binoculars or something like that on a good wet year, you could see the blue curls from there.
Great. Okay. I don't think I have any more questions. So thank you very much, Colin. We really appreciate your presentation. And like I said, we will follow up with some of the links to information that was mentioned. Before we conclude, I want to do two things. We do have the recording of this presentation that will be available, and I'm going to ask Ed to just give folks the information about how you can obtain the recorded program. Ed, if you would do that, and then Orchid's going to announce our next program.
So thank you so much, Colin. That was a great talk. And thanks for you putting the CalFlora slides in there, because that leads into our next talk. Our next talk is learning even more about your favorite local native plants using CalFlora. So that will be Saturday, February 20th at 10 a.m. It is going to build on our previous CalFlora talk that we had live, but you do not have to have attended that talk to attend this talk. Cynthia Powell will be our speaker. She'll go over how to use CalFlora to learn about your regional plants, about their photo project, about their iNaturalist data feed, if you do use iNaturalist, as Colin was suggesting, about their population monitoring tools, and soil, water, and climate tolerances for specific plants. If you still are planting your natives, they do have a planting guide to see which plants will grow in your region. And I use their What Grows Here all the time to make plant palette lists for clients. So you can learn how to do that as well. Hope to see you on the 20th at 10 a.m. Thanks a lot.
The link to the recorded video will be put out on our Facebook. So that information will go out in the same method that you learned about today's presentation. Thank you all.